So I want to talk a little bit now. We alluded to this a little earlier about the adolescence and what's the deal with that. And adolescence is a critical period of brain development for addiction. You're very unlikely, it can happen, I mean you can work at it and make it work, but it's much harder to get addicted to a substance when you are my age than when you're a teen. In fact, the research is clear. If you don't become addicted to nicotine, to cigarettes, by the time you're 21 or 22 years old, you don't become, which is why the tobacco companies knew that, which is why that they marketed to kids with Joe Camel. I mean, their internal research documents show, hey, if we don't get these folks hooked by their early 20s, it ain't going to happen. And it's like that for almost everything. Now, it happened. I mean, you know, I saw a doctor one time who had never used drugs at all, was just a healthy guy, great life, was running, blew out his knee, had some knee surgery, they gave him opiates, and it got him there. But for the most part, it doesn't. So what is unique about this adolescent brain? I can speak about this from two areas, two levels. One, from my academic background, and number two, because I have two adolescent sons. So here's a neuropsychological representation of the adolescent brain. Just came out. It's a NIDA study. So we certainly have the rebellion center, the ego, the love parents and hate parents. This vacillates on a daily basis. TV storage or video game storage. But of course, the idea that the drugs are good. Now, you know, my son don't use drugs, and he said, "Oh yeah, you're being pretty naive, Herkov. How you know your kids don't use drugs?" I believe in what W.C. Fields says. I trust everybody but to cut the cards. I drug test my kids. I do. I drug test them. And they pissed and moaned about it for a while. It's like, you know, son, I've seen what this can do, and if you test positive, and I've of course got all the tests at my office, I just bring them home and say, here you go fill this up for me. In fact, true story, my son plays baseball. And they test him there. My son sells his urine. He sells his urine to his friends because he's clean as a driven snow. I said, son, what are you doing? Oh, I'm going to get so-and-so. For what? Well, they're going to test, and he, okay, man. So what happens? What is the issue that we've going on here? Well, we know that the brain develops from the back to the front, okay? And that the very last thing to develop in the human brain is sort of this frontal lobe. In fact, the frontal lobes don't fully develop until about your mid-20s. And we know that because there's certain things we don't teach kids. We don't teach kids things like calculus when they're 11 years old, because they don't have the frontal lobe, they don't have the capacity to think about those sorts of relationships. Part of the process that takes place is this idea of neuronal development, right? There is a flurry of development of new neurons within the brain during childhood. But by the time when they start getting to adolescence, there's a process that takes place called pruning, which means the number of neurons actually decreases and the neurons that are there become more specialized. And the idea of pruning kind of makes sense. If you ever have a tree or a bush in your backyard, if you just let it go crazy, eventually it's not that healthy. At some point, you know, you have all these sprouts that come out, but at some point, certain things need to be trimmed out to give more light, to give to increase it, and that's actually what happens in this adolescent brain. And unfortunately, it tends to correspond at a time when they get introduced to drugs or alcohol, right? We know that there's significant development that takes place in this nucleus accumbens, okay? The idea of this pleasure center, which makes them much more vulnerable to the effects of a drug. A smaller dose and a less frequent administration pattern will lead to dependence or addiction much faster in an adolescent than it will in you or I. We also know that the prefrontal cortex is particularly vulnerable here in impulsivity, right? It's why I pay like $2 grand a year for insurance on my son's car, right? It's because, you know, they don't know my son, but they know 17-year-olds. and they know they're sensation-seeking, risk-taking, poor organization and planning, right? I mean, if you have teenage kids, you're there with me. Attention, focus, this whole concept of working memory, that's when all these things are taking place. That's when this pruning is going on. So it's at this stage when the brain is really set up for salience. What am I going to pay attention to? Well, if I'm dumping a drug in my brain right now, those pathways, that pruning that's being set up now, it's being oriented to that drug. In fact, I was just talking with somebody over the break. When we talk about the craving for addiction for a drug, you certainly have craving in the active phase of the drug, right? You start going through withdrawal, one reason, and you start craving the drug. But after that takes place, after your body has returned to normal, after your receptors in the brain have returned to normal, to pre-morbid drug levels, you still have that craving. You can take somebody who hasn't smoked for 10 years, show them a cigarette, and you'll start getting a little bit of popping of that dopamine. Why? Because those pathways remain for decades. That learning, that is a well-known path through the wilderness. And so the person knows exactly where that leads, and that makes it very difficult for them to stop.
That's the same mechanism that, say, a person hasn't used drugs or drinking for 40 years.
That's right.
Right back.
40. That's it. And it's not just necessarily a visual cue, right? Maybe going by a bar or seeing a. I mean, you remember the old movie Hill Street Blues with the guy? He would keep that bottle in his. It's not just a visual cue. It can be an emotional cue because, right, this gets paired not only with visual things, but with emotional things. So, you know, my drinking of the glass of wine is paired with that emotional, that fun, that being with my wife on the back porch. So when I have some of those emotional feelings, that clicks it. So big problem. So let's talk about brain function. By the way, this ad just wasn't very effective. This is your brain on drugs. Why? Because the adolescents are just too stupid to understand that. I mean, that's a bad way of saying it. They just haven't had the life experience, right? I mean, I can remember, you know, when I first had my degree in psychology, I was much smarter than I am now. And the reason is because I didn't know how much I didn't know, right? I mean, and so, you know, they just have it all figured out. And our house is like the congregating place for the teens of my son's friends. And you know how many discussions I've gotten in with these experts on marijuana and drugs. You know, it's like, you know, I was the chief of forensic addiction medicine at the University of Florida. You might want to listen to me on this, but no, I saw on Reddit, I didn't. So let's talk about marijuana. Marijuana is the most widely used illicit drug, although it's, of course, becoming less and less of an illicit drug, especially in our country. Let's talk a little bit about how that works and why it's such a problem and what it does to the human brain. Well, marijuana affects the endogenous cannabinoid receptors in the brain. Yes, it was put there for a reason. Despite marijuana, it is the endorphins, has to do with mood, has to do with pain regulation. There is a chemical, anandamide, in the brain, which is the naturally occurring neurotransmitter that is involved in this cannabinoid system. You can see that it is very similar to THC that you get from marijuana. And so that particular marijuana can binds to that particular receptor site. It's like the key. It's not the original key, but it's a close enough key that it goes in there and it turns the lock on or off, and it has that particular neuron to then fire. Okay? So we talked about THC, and we talked about the reward area of the brain and where these receptors are, and of course they are in the reward area of the brain. Otherwise, if it wasn't there, we wouldn't use it. But look where else they are. It's not that just these receptors are just within the reward area. They're all over the brain. where they're back in the cerebellum, which is probably why you don't want somebody driving when they're using this substance. But look how it is up in the frontal lobe. Look how it is in the parietal lobe. It's why some people get these strange sensations when they are using marijuana. Just saw a recent statistic about the increase in marijuana in ER visits. There's a group called DAWN, it's the early warning system. I think the University of Michigan that does it, I forget that does it, but it sort of tracks when a drug problem is coming. They let us know it's on its way, and they do it by tracking how many of the ER visits are associated with people who come in who have been using this drug, and we saw it spike with cocaine in the 1980s. Well, there's a spike now in the increase of marijuana visits to the ER. So we see so we know right now, just by looking at this, well, it's going to affect more than this. We're going to expect to see some other things from this. Well, okay, but we have that system within the brain, so what's the big deal, Herkov? Well, there's a dopamine release from an anandamide, and there's some marijuana. Just like everything else we've talked about, right? It hijacks, it takes over, it releases much more dopamine than the natural system does, right? You get a release of endorphins when you run. You have to run like around Jacksonville 3 times to get this type of release that you can just get simply by taking a few tokes on the old blunt. Of course, the most significant thing about marijuana, or one of the most significant things, is the change in the marijuana, right? The marijuana your kids are using ain't the marijuana that their folks used. This is the increase in the THC levels within marijuana. Just from the early 1990s to now. You go back to the 1960s, it was around 2%. Yeah. This is not the same stuff. I mean, this is like drinking 3-2 beer, and you get 3-2 beer. So you probably know what it is. Those of us who are up north know. Back in the olden days, when I went to college, the drinking age was 18, 21 for liquor, but 18 for beer. But you had to drink something called 3.2 beer. So instead of the beer, I think it's 5.7 or 6% alcohol. Well, this was beer that was only 3.2% alcohol. Of course, it never dawned on them that if I can drink 2 of those, and that still equals this. I can remember when I grew up in Pittsburgh, we would drive to West Virginia because Pennsylvania was 21, West Virginia was 18, and so just a safe trip down the interstate allowed you to go to West Virginia and drink this 3.2 beer until your heart's content. So this is 3.2 beer, and this is 191 grain. Okay, so we are pickling these brains now with a marijuana that has never really been seen before. This is a statistic I talked about. It's looking at the ER visits associated by marijuana use per 100,000 people. And look what's happened from the early 2000s until just a couple of years ago. And we see this as a steady increase. This is primarily associated with societal values towards marijuana. I didn't do it today because I didn't have time, but I mean, the celebrity endorsement for marijuana. You got this guy on TV, Snoop Dogg. Snoop Dogg came to the University of Florida for Gator Growl. I wouldn't go. I was so hacked off on that. Snoop Dogg is most famous for being baked. That's kind of what he did. I guess he was a rapper or a singer or something at one time. But he's like most famous for using marijuana all the time. And this is the guy that we're putting up in top of Gator Growl. I thought it was pathetic. But I mean, we've had surgeon generals that have. We've got politicians that talk about it, and they just don't get this. We talked about at dinner last night about this. There's a book. If you get a chance to read it, it's fascinating. It's by a fellow by the name of David Musto, M-U-S-T-O, and it's called The American Disease. And it talks about addiction, and it talks about how basically what happens is any drug that you try to get to market has to go through the FDA takes it a decade. My brother-in-law works for GSK, Glasgow Klein Smith. It takes them a decade and millions of dollars to get a drug through because they got to prove that it's safe. A drug is assumed to be dangerous until they can prove it's safe. Not with drugs of addiction. With drugs of addiction, it's the other way around. It's considered to be safe until it's proven to be dangerous. So we had this thing about, you know, the synthetic marijuana that was out there that you could buy at the head shops that just made people go BS crazy. Well, it was safe. Do we have to show them? No, it's not. Well, his book talks about how, he talks about the opioid crisis. And we're in an opioid crisis right now in this country. You would agree, right? The opioid crisis we have right now is nothing compared to the opioid crisis we had in 1900. In 1900, we had 1 million opiate addicts in the United States. 1 million, when our population was a fraction of what it is now, right? And we were talking, when I give my lecture, I can show you ads about the benefits of heroin, that they had heroin in Bayer cough syrup, and it talked about the benefits of it. I can show you an ad. I wish I'd have brought it, but I can show you, it's probably on my computer, if you want to see it afterwards. I can show you an ad where a mixture of cocaine and wine is recommended by no other than Thomas Edison and Pope Leo. He was known as the Happy Pope. It's a substance called Vin Mariani. Well, and then so what happens is we have these million opiate addicts, right? And the country is just going to hell in a handbasket. The government comes in and says, what have we done here? They impose all these laws called the Harrison Act, and they start really regulating what you can do with these things. And society says, oh yeah, that's bad. And then you have a generation comes through or so, and they forget. And then we learn it again. And so now we're learning about opiates again. We saw the same thing happen with cocaine.
Michael, just out of curiosity, what do you think now the rate is per 100,000 people on opiates for emergency room visits?
You know, I have that slide somewhere I can't give you, but it is, I can't give you the exact numbers, so I don't have it memorized, but I can tell you it's even more. It's like this. It's like this. It has really spiked. And because, of course, the opiates are life-threatening, right? I mean, they'll kill you. See, you're probably not going to die from marijuana. You're going to die from some associated marijuana behavior. You're not going to die from marijuana use. Drew was talking last night about a friend of ours, Ray Palm, who has a special program that they're involved. Or no, it wasn't Drew. It was somebody. I forget. That talks about a special program where they go into ERs now for people who are there because they're on an opiate-related issue. Take them right from the ER right to treatment. It's having Project
Save Life.
Save life. And I think they told me that the relapse rate for like the last 8 months is 0. It's like, I mean, Jesus must be involved in that one because I don't know how you get a relapse rate of 0. That's impressive. But anyhow.
That's
So,
only 17 clients. I think it's very new.
Still though, 17 is, I mean,
Not far into the process yet, I don't think.
yeah, but if you look at opiate relapse rates after detox, I mean, it's well over 60%, right? So the fact that they've gone 7 or 8 months is just impressive as heck. Yes.
You did have a client 2 weeks ago that had OD'd with fentanyl that was on the marijuana that he smoked because he said all I smoked was the pot, and then when they finally checked, he had fentanyl.
Oh yeah, that's bad stuff. That's bad stuff. So here's a statistic, a slide that is going to upset you. It upsets me. This is the rate, and this actually comes from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. So this is not done by, you know, some outfit, fly-by-night outfit, and it looks at the use of marijuana in adolescents 12 to 17 by state. And in green, you see the states that have legalized marijuana either for recreational use, because it's just an herb, it's just a plant. I mean, so is hemlock, right? I mean, huh?
Safe plant.
Yeah, it's a safe plant, right? You know, cocaine comes from a plant, so do opiates. But what you see here is that look at where it's, and the argument is like, look, we were not going to give this to kids. This is just for medicinal purposes, and we are not going to have, this has nothing to do, kids are not going, in fact, the money we make from the sales tax on this is going to help us with treatment programs for anybody who develops this illness, right? And that's just a bunch of hogwash. You can see that anytime you make something legal, it has a perception of safety, right? And so if you have people, I mean, I got a picture of a dispensary there in Gainesville, man, right there on 34th Street. I drove by, I said, you got to be freaking kidding me. But the important thing about this slide is that you are going to see more and more use, and a decade, 2 decades from now, we are going to get the full-born brunt of this devastation on our society. And I feel like, not just me, but I feel like a lone voice in the wilderness where I had a recent symposium where I was talking about medical use of marijuana and arguing against it. And I had these physicians that it's like, they were saying all this, saying these things that were just completely fallacious based on, non-existent data. And it's going to cause us problems. All right. So we talk about 2 types of brain matter, white matter and gray matter. You hear it all the time. What is that? Well, in case you don't know, gray matter is the nucleus of the neuron, the cell body. And the white matter are the wires, the axons and the dendrites that come out. We see that in marijuana users and non-users, there are specific brain differences, especially in this area. This is communication between various parts of the brain. Daily users opposed to non-users. Don't think for a second that it doesn't affect a brain function. So I want to talk now, the rest of the show, about what cognitive effects do we have. How does this affect your brain after you stop using? I think we all agree when you're using, your brain's not functioning. But how about when you stop? What do we expect to see after that? And I'm going to talk about things. There's tons of literature out there, right? I mean, just tons. Drew's involved in a thing. It's called Research You Can Use. Is that what it's called? I get the email on that. And you should ask him for the email because it's cutting edge stuff. He does it with Dr. Gold, and it's stuff that, like, if you read it, you'll be the smartest person in the room, right? Now, we were talking last night about the use of ketamine in the treatment of depression. By the way, if you haven't heard of that, ketamine, which is an anesthesia that was used for dogs. It was a drug of abuse. We hated ketamine. Turns out that it may actually be a pretty potent, almost immediate cure for serious depression. But so there's tons of articles. So what I did for this talk and what I try to deal with is I deal with meta-analytic studies. And the meta-analytic studies, what they do is they go and they look at a bunch of studies, 50 studies, 100 studies, and they combine the results to say, what is the effect of this? And they talk about, you'll hear me talk today, I'll be reporting all the data, will be in something called an effect size. What's an effect size? So if you remember from your college statistics class, we talked about p-values and significant. This group is significantly different from that group at the p05 level, right? That means that the 2 means statistically are different. But it's based on sample size. And so you could have somebody, like, I drink coffee and my IQ is 100. You don't drink coffee and your IQ is 98. And because we have enough people, that's a significant difference. But in actuality, it's only 2 points. It has no clinical significance. Effect size studies, what they do is that they look at the means of 2 populations, right? Because we have a group of marijuana users, and we have a group of non-marijuana users. And we test their IQ. And there's going to be some people who use marijuana who have a higher IQ than people who don't use marijuana, right? That's just going to happen. And that's, of course, what happens all the time, right? I give my spiel to the Boy Scouts. I give it to sports teams. I give it to any high school kid that will stay still long enough to listen to me, to tell them about, don't use drugs. And they'll say, you'll get the invariably, Yeah, you know, I know a kid in my AP history class, and he uses everything in the world, and he's the smartest kid in the world. And so you must be wrong, you know? And, you know, I get it, but we know the person, you know, my Uncle Mike smoked Camel cigarettes from the time he was 12 years old until he died when he, I think, was 84, never got lung cancer. Well, then cigarettes must not cause lung cancer, right? I mean, you can't look at those outliers. And so what this does is it looks at how the means of the two groups, forget about this overlap stuff, but how are fundamentally, are they significantly different? And we talk about effect sizes. And effect sizes, you'll see 0.2 is called a small effect size. Okay? Medium is about up to 0.5, moderate up to 0.5, and 0.80 is a large effect size. So that helps us understand what are the results. Now, I'm going to talk about a study first, and this is a seminal study. This one doesn't particularly follow this, but here's what this is: a study that was done out of Duke that were involved in it. It's the Dunedin Study, and it looked at the persistent neuropsychological effects in cannabis users. Okay, it's a unique study. I think it's got 1,000 subjects on it. Okay, and what they were able to do is they tested all these kids, okay, back in 1986, before any of them used marijuana. Nobody used marijuana at the time, and then they did follow-up on these folks, ending in 2012. So this is a fantastic study, because we're not just looking at group differences, we're looking at individual differences. Okay? You see Michael's IQ in 1986. You then see my IQ in 2012. I never used marijuana. What's the difference? You see Billy, who had his IQ in 1986, never used marijuana. Used marijuana over his lifespan. What was his IQ like in 2012? So it's a fantastic study. You'll see it quoted all the time. So they tested him, 13, 18, 21, 32, 38 years old, okay? 5 different times. And here's the data, all right? For those who never used marijuana, okay, at 13 years old, and still never used marijuana at 38 years old, their IQ was 99.8 and 100.6. Identical. Right? They're not a significant difference, the same thing. Here's the group that never used marijuana when they were 13 years old, and then used it over the course of their lifetime. Now this, I need to be transparent. I'm trying to summarize some of the data here. The amount that they used here, these people were more significant users. This is somebody who used it when they were 15, and then a couple times when they were 20. These are people that have been more significant users. Their IQ fell from 99 to 93. That's a half a standard deviation. Okay, standard deviation in IQ scores is 15. So the IQ score at 100, you would be at the 50th percentile, okay, average bear. You drop down to 90, and your IQ score has fallen out to the 25th percentile. So you've gone from here in the line down to here in the line. That is a significant difference. Yes?
Michael, it seems like to me that's a very hard way to have I mean, it's very difficult to have a control group on a study like that. I mean, am I mistaken on that?
Well, it's almost...
all self-reporting, and it's all, right?
Yeah, I don't think they did urine drug screens on that. I'd have to go back and get into the nuts and bolts of it. It's almost an impossible study. Think of how expensive it is. You've got to follow these people over, basically, 18 years. It's self-report. It's almost always self-report. I mean, it goes both ways. It's also supposed to be exclusively marijuana use, but how much is that? We don't really know that. So any research has its issues, but even independent of that, I think it's a pretty powerful statistic in terms of what cannabis use does long-term to the brain when it's cannabis use starts in adolescence. It's just for all the reasons that we talked about. We're looking at effect sizes now. This is their full-scale IQ score, which we talked about. Verbal comprehension, information. This is a key one. This is a test called similarities. And with this is a frontal lobe test. What it requires the person to do is you give the person a word, 2 words. Tell me how an apple and an orange are alike. Okay? Well, they're both round. Okay, so that's a 1-point answer. They're both fruit. Okay. How are democracy and democracy and dictatorship alike? Well, they're not. Well, yeah, they actually are. That's right. This requires your frontal lobes are activating pretty high here because they've got to figure out what's the association between this. That has a almost 0.5 effect size. Digit symbol. I'll show you what some of these tests are. I should have had those slides up first. I must have messed them around. This is a measure of processing speed, of working memory, and it has a huge impact. So the results from this study are unequivocal that marijuana use results in chronic cognitive changes. And I don't know about you, but I need all the IQ points I can get, and half a standard deviation is pretty significant in terms of the impact that it has had. What do you think is going to happen in our society when we become more liberal in terms, not politically, more liberal in terms of allowing this marijuana use? We're going to make it just like alcohol. Guess what? You don't get this from...
Teenagers will start smoking weed today.
How many?
7,000 today, 7,000 tomorrow. It's unsustainable.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, it's just another drug. Look at alcohol. Alcohol doesn't do this. Alcohol will destroy you, don't get me wrong, but it takes it a very long time. Why do you think all the sports teams, when they do testing, test for things like marijuana, cocaine, but they don't test for alcohol? It's going to take... No, it's not that it's just legal. It's just that the deleterious effect it's going to have on you is going to take years and years and years to develop. You will not develop a dementia from alcohol. You will not see cognitive decline from alcohol in your 20s. You've got to drink hard and heavy for a long time. You can do it with some of these drugs. You can have the effects in months. These are just these are a whole bunch of other things. This is on a task of verbal learning, how we can learn a list of words. This has to do on memory. This is processing speed, how fast your brain works. That's a 0.6. This is memory, verbal memory for stories. These are significant impairments. This is not something to be taken lightly. Talk a little bit about some of the other drugs that we see. Benzodiazepines. Yes, sir.
Before you move off from marijuana, when is it appropriate to do an evaluation, neuropsych evaluation on a patient?
In terms of...
Let's say you get an 18-year-old comes in and with marijuana use, has a history of blackouts, not sure whether marijuana use in gas is laced with fentanyl or spice or what.
Right.
And a lot of people would like to wait until the drug is completely out of the system and 30 days before they do the neuropsych. Is it appropriate to do the neuropsych right away when they come in?
So it depends what your referral question is. Okay. So for example, when I was at working with impaired professionals, we would do the neuropsych doctors, okay, nurses. We would do the neuropsych evaluation when they came in at the very first time. Why? Well, because we had a responsibility to show to the state what is their cognitive function right now. What is are they impaired, right? Because I got to know now. Yeah, guy says I don't have a problem, Well, you may not have a problem, but you're functioning now at the 16th percentile, and that's a problem. And we kept a lot of folks not practicing just based on, Dr. Holbert and I worked with that group, just based on that. If I were doing it on an adolescent who I didn't have that sort of an issue, you know, I wouldn't necessarily do, if I was looking at long-term effects, I might wait 3 months, 6 months, but the data is that even after abstinence, these things just don't go away. So you can see the effects on this 6 months, a year out, sometimes longer than that. And again, it comes down to individual differences. Some people are much more sensitive to this than other people. Some people are much more sensitive to the cognitive effects of a drug than other people. We know people who use MDMA who don't have that catastrophic brain loss. Why? Look, if I could tell you why, I wouldn't be talking to you today. I would have just resigned from NIDA and I'd be on my island in the Bahamas, and I'd be drinking, you know, something. So it depends on what you're trying to do. Then we would have to come back with those doctors or nurses, and after they had been in recovery for treatment for 3 months, then we'd say, okay, let's test them again. And maybe they recovered, but there would be times when, you know what, we've had to have doctors out 6 months, a year, because their brain had not recovered from the drug to what we would expect to have been pre-morbid or appropriate levels. You know, I've got a couple more minutes. Let's see. I won't talk much about this, except that that's not GABE. It's actually GABA. But benzodiazepines affect the GABA receptors in the brain. They too are all over the brain. High concentration in the hippocampus. Hippocampus is an important part of the brain. It's that part of the brain that takes memories and stamps them and puts them where they're supposed to go. I liken it to the librarian, right? A bunch of books come into the library. You bring all your books back in this big thing. Yeah, they're all books, but it's up to that librarian to take that book and then put it here. And if she doesn't do that, then when you go to look for the book, it's not there. She was a lazy librarian. She just sort of threw it out, and it got swept away, and so it's not there. Or she took it, but instead of filing under the BF section, she put it under the SC section, so nobody can find the book there. That's what the hippocampus does. High concentration of GABA receptors within the hippocampus. It's why they use these drugs as date rape drugs, because you never form the memories. You don't remember what happened. Long-term benzodiazepine use does that, and I'm going to show you a case study about that. This is a meta-analytic study that I talked about, almost 300 users, and we are looking now at effect size, cognitive effects of benzodiazepine abuse. Benzodiazepines particularly problematic in cognitive function, whether we're talking about attention concentration, problem solving, IQ, memory, processing speed. These are not trifling, okay?
At what dosage level?
It depends, and I'm going to show you somebody that was on 12 milligrams of Xanax a day. Huh?
12?
Yeah. Huh?
That's low, isn't it?
No, it's about 4. I mean, most people. We got a physician. What would you? Most people around 4.
That's high.
You know, it's prescribed in 0.5 milligrams. You know, 0.25 milligrams. Couple. Yeah, 12 milligrams is a pretty good dose. I mean, that would put all of us naive users in here. That would put us to sleep, for a while. But I'll talk about. So the issue is, in answer to your question, it's kind of hard because these are meta-analytic studies. To know, so there's not a precise dose, different studies, but this is a sort of a combination of all the data together. And these data were obtained well after the person had stopped using. Same thing with opiates. We think that opiates are relatively safe in terms of cognitive function. They too are scattered throughout the brain. 2012 study, almost 800 users on opiates, and they're not. This is a 0.7 effect size on impulsivity, short-term verbal memory, cognitive flexibility, long-term memory. These are significant changes. These substances go well beyond and affect a person well after the stage of active intoxication and even recovery. And for those of you in recovery, that you got to understand that the person you're dealing with may have a difficult time understanding the principles that you're trying to teach them because their brain ain't working. So, it's why they're not getting it. Well, they're not getting it. They're not motivated for treatment. Sometimes, but not motivated for treatment doesn't make them a bad person. It may be that salience, that their brain, those pathways, they can't focus on what it is you want them to focus on, which is why some people have to do it again and again, and why it takes a long time, and why we talk about recovery as a process, not an outcome. I only have a couple more minutes, so I just will go through some of this. Cocaine. This is meta-analytic studies, 1,500 users. Cocaine, attention, executive function, right? Impulsivity, processing speed, learning. Some people well over 12 months out. One of the studies on the opiates was looking at folks that were being evaluated 60 months out. That's almost 5 years. Now, not everybody. Some people recover quicker. The problem is we don't know who is who. We don't have any test that says, okay, your cognitive effects will be relatively mild, yours will be severe. Just like right now, we don't have the test who's going to become addicted to something and who's not, although we're working on that. Let me just go through and talk a little bit about some of these, a case, let's see. Let me talk about a case study. This is a woman that I saw. It's a 54-year-old married white female, college educated, ICU nurse, who was sent to us after she had been caught diverting benzodiazepines at the hospital, right? This is a woman who had dedicated her life to helping people, who was basically robbing patients of their medication. You know, one for you, one for me, one for you, two for me. She was under-medicating her patients so that she could feed her head. Got caught, got sent to us for treatment, put her through the program. Been using about 12 years, she said. Again, self-report, I don't know. Said she was using 12 milligrams a day, relatively high dose for that period of time. She had come in, she was a mess, had gone through, had been abstinent 90 days, 3 months, hadn't touched a single one. Okay, okay, you're good to go, working your recovery program good. I'm ready to go back to work. All right, let's have Herkov take a look at you before we sign off. Okay, here's our neuropsych test scores. Verbal comprehension. This is a score, I think it was like maybe 117. The way IQ score works is mean is 100, standard deviation is 15. By the time you get up there, she's probably at around the 89th percentile. It's a smart woman, okay? This is, though, measured in terms of long-term memory. This is who was president of the United States during the Civil War. What does the word scurrilous mean? Long-term sorts of memories. You either have it or you don't. This is perceptual reasoning, being able to solve puzzles. Fine. We then get here down to working memory. Working memory, your ability to temporarily hold information for further processing, juggle things around, right? So simple attention is something like, I'm going to give you a list of numbers. 1, 7, 2, 9, 6, 4. Tell me the numbers back. 1, 7. 2, 9, 6, 4. Right. Now, working memory is, I'm going to tell you some numbers, but when I'm done, I want you to give them to me backwards. 1, 7, 2, 9, 6, 4. You see, though, it's a much different cognitive process, right? I've got to hold the numbers in the order that I receive them, and I've got to manipulate them in my brain. This came down now, I think it was a score of a 79. Now we're looking at about the 9th or 10th percentile. And the question I always get from people is, well, okay, this is average, but how where does it become impaired? And my response is always, well, use your own standard in terms of who would you want to be your IQ, who you want to be your ICU nurse or your mother's ICU nurse. Do you want the person who's at the 90th percentile, or do you want the person who's at the 9th percentile? It's an easy answer for me. Fascinating test here, California Verbal Learning Test. Basically, I'll be done in 1 second.
No, I just want this to not trip you.
Oh, I thought you were going to give me the hook because I'm 2 minutes over. I'll finish up here. Test of 16 words. Okay, give you a list of 16 words. You got to say them back to me. Probably it exceeds everybody's capacity for single trial. I don't think I've had everybody get all 16. But then I give it to you 5 more times. Okay, so her performance the first time we gave it to her, I think was like a 76, which puts her at about the 6th percentile. By the time I give it to her 5 times, she's now up in the average range at about the probably 37th or 40th percentile. Okay, well she's doing okay. So what's the big deal? Well, when somebody tells my ICU nurse something, I kind of like her to get it the first time, because they may not say it to her 5 times, and if she's not getting it the first time, then she's not going to get it. She was devastated. I said, look, I wrote to IPN. I don't think this person can practice. And here's the reasons why. And these people can get retested again. Sometimes it comes back. Sometimes it never comes back. And you've just lost a life and a career. So I'm going to stop. I'm 7 minutes over. I apologize for that. Any questions before they kick me out of here that I can answer for you? No? All right. Thank you all very much. It's been a great audience.